Welcome to our Teaching the World 2023 webinar. We're really excited as we have registrants joining us from around the world or who are from around the world. So feel free to introduce yourself in the chat and share where you're located. Today's focus is on innovative practices from the first two volumes in the Rowman and Littlefield's Global Teacher Education book series. And please use the question and answer button for any questions you may have. And we will ask panelists to answer those questions during the talk. We want to begin the presentation asking each of us to take a moment to reflect upon where you're sitting or standing in the world at this moment in time. And we want to reflect on the histories, experiences, stories, and counter narratives of your particular location on the earth and the people who have worked and suffered so that we have the privilege of joining today's webinar. I, for example, am sitting in Lenape-Hoking, the land of the Lenni Lenape. And we know that at Rutgers, we have really benefited from more than 200,000 acres of land, which were ceded by numerous tribal nations in response to violence. So our campus itself was built upon the labor of enslaved people. And we are really committed to learning about these histories and telling counter narratives and being mindful as we teach, work, and live on Indigenous land at an institution that is dependent on the sale of Black people to fund its very existence. So as we're together today gathering, we're thinking about how in our daily lives and actions, and especially as we engage in global education efforts, we will honor the Lenni Lenape and other Indigenous caretakers of these and your lands and waters, Indigenous and Black elders who have lived here before, those who were forcibly removed to the west and to the north, those who were enslaved, and the Indigenous, tribal, and Black communities here today and the generations to come. So today, our plan is that we have two sessions. We're focusing on the two books in the Rowman and Littlefield Global Education series. And I want to give you a little short backstory. Several years ago, Nilufer, Guler, and I were at the American Association of Colleges of Teacher Education annual meeting. We met Mark Kerr, one of the editors at Rowman and Littlefield, and we pitched the idea of the Global Teacher Education book series. And we're so honored and excited that today we're going to be sharing some from both of these first books. So we've got the At School in the World, Developing Globally Engaged Teachers, and editors Nilufer, Guler, and Carine Ullom are here today. And then we have the Human Rights Imperative in Teacher Education, and Bill Fernekes, one of the editors, is here with us today. So I am going to be turning this over to them, and they are going to share with you, with some of their authors, a little bit about the books. So let's see here. We'll begin with At School in the World, and I will stop sharing so that you can share your slides.
Thank you, Mary. This first little 5-minute stretch, we don't have any slides for, but thank you. We're so delighted to have been invited to share a little bit about our new book this evening. While the flyer that went out says that the speakers will be Nilufer and I, what we would like to do instead is to give the floor to 3 of our chapter authors and author teams. The 15 chapters in this volume were written by 47 authors from 10 different countries, and we're happy to have the authors of 3 of those chapters with us this evening. Interestingly, it turned out completely by chance, because each of them volunteered their time, that they represent 3 of the 4 sections of the book. I don't know if any of you have had a chance to see or read the book, but it has 4 sections. One of them is global competence. One is supporting global competence development in pre-service teachers. The third one is international collaboration in teacher preparation programs. And the last one is professional development for teacher educators. And we have 3 of the 4 of those represented, and I'll explain that as we go. Just a little bit about the book and how it came to be. This volume grew out of a project that Nilufer and I undertook with support of the Longview Foundation. They gave us a small grant to create a year-long professional development program for faculty around the theme of internationalizing teacher education. And we presented our work at the same AACTE conference that Mary just referenced, which was the same year that the Rowman and Littlefield folks connected with the topical action group on internationalizing teacher education about possibly editing a series, and Nilufer and Mary teamed up to co-edit the series, and then Nilufer and I teamed up to co-edit this volume in the series. I just want to read to you what we wrote in our preface that kind of describes how we approached this project. It took 2.5 years. It was quite the undertaking. Of course, COVID had something to do with that. Our goal from the outset was to include authors from all over the world and to decenter US and Western perspectives. Unfortunately, this evening we have only North American authors represented, partly because of the timing of the event. We hope to hold other events where we can include the scholars from elsewhere around the world. And although we were overwhelmed by proposals, we were not as successful as we would have liked to have been in terms of getting a true global representation among our authorship. We recognize and acknowledge that writing in English, when English is not the language of fluency, is a challenge, and perhaps not a challenge that everyone was willing or able to take on. And this is one of the many ways in which the Academy excludes global voices. Parallel to this is the sad reality that because this volume is written in American English, it is inaccessible for some would-be readers, thus reinforcing the Western imperialism of the Academy. We wanted to recognize those limitations in the work that we have produced. But we also want to let you know a little bit about the process that the authors went through. I think that sometimes there's a perception that getting published in a book is somehow less rigorous than being published in a peer-reviewed journal. And I just want you to know that nothing could be further from the truth in terms of this volume. And I'm sure that the authors will agree with me that they were put through their paces. We had 56 proposals, and roughly half of those, about 26 of them, made it through the first round. That round was the selection process that was just managed by Nilufer and myself. And then those that were selected from that pool, those 26 were invited to submit a full chapter. We received 25 full chapters back, and then those were put through a double-blind review process with 3 peer reviewers. So you can imagine that a lot of eyes were on this work. And of those then that came back from that peer review process, we had 17 chapters that we were working with. And at the end of the day, we ended up with 15 that made it to publication. So just wanted you to know that they have been through a rigorous process. They had multiple, sometimes 4, 5, 6, 7 iterations of their work, and all of them survived that process with patience and grace, and we're very grateful to them for sticking with us. So without further ado, I want to introduce to you our first presenter, Nanda Dimitrov. She is going to present her chapter that she co-wrote with Dr. Darla Deerdorf. I'm sure that's a name familiar to many of you. Their chapter is entitled Intercultural Competence as the Core to Developing Globally Engaged Teachers. We chose this chapter intentionally as the first chapter of the book because it seems to lay the foundation for making the case about why intercultural competence is the beginning, the first step in the process of developing globally engaged teachers, the theme of the book. Mary, I think you're planning on putting Nanda's bio in the chat pod, so I won't take time to read it, and instead I'll give the floor to Nanda so she has as much time as possible to share with us. Thank you, Nanda.
And thank you too. We're having some trouble with the chat. It seems to be disabled, which it shouldn't be. We're trying to fix that, and then we'll put all the bios in if we can make that work. So you can take it away.
Thank you so much, everyone. Thank you, Carine and Nilufer. It's such a pleasure to be here and to speak with everyone. And thank you for all of your mentorship and support throughout the writing process. We've learned so much as we were preparing a chapter during the pandemic. Such an exciting process. So I'll try to be short to leave time for questions. So our chapter focuses on intercultural competence as the core to developing globally engaged teachers. And I would like to acknowledge my colleague, Darla Deerdorf, who I think everybody knows and many of you are familiar with her framework. And it's been such a pleasure to work together to think about how do we mentor teachers along their learning journey as they're developing their intercultural competence. So As I begin speaking about this work, I want to acknowledge that I'm grateful to speak to you today from the traditional Coast Salish lands of the Squamish, Musqueam, and Tsleil-Waututh and Coquitlam nations. You see our beautiful campus at Simon Fraser University here on top of Burnaby Mountain, which is called the place where the bark gets peeled in the spring. Now, we got about 2 feet of snow yesterday, which is very unusual here. So spring does not look like it's coming, but normally it would be here in Burnaby. And so, as Carine mentioned, ours is chapter 1. Such an honor to begin this conversation. And so I just wanted to start by sharing with you our conceptualization of how we thought about globally engaged teachers based on Darla's work and my work and seeing the intersection of that. And so we think of globally engaged teachers as colleagues who apply and model intercultural competence in their classroom as they navigate the diversity in their own interactions with students in our increasingly diverse classrooms. At my own institution, we have students from about 100 countries. 60% of our students speak a language other than English as their first language. It's a hyper diverse community. And so it's designing and helping teachers to prepare to teach in those classrooms that we have here at SFU and of course around the world. And so globally engaged teachers can facilitate interaction and relationship building across difference among those students in their classroom and create safe and inclusive learning environments. And then the third piece that we felt was really important is that they mentor and support their students in their own development of their intercultural competence. So it's facilitating interaction and mentoring their students in their own intercultural journey. And they do that by modeling. Modeling is a really critical component of intercultural competence for teachers. So anything we do in the classroom demonstrates to our students what intercultural interaction looks like or can look like if it's effective. As well as for me, one of the pieces that I'm really excited about is having teachers create learning experiences that give students an opportunity to practice perspective taking. I'm the director of a large center for educational excellence. And so my colleagues and I work in faculty development, and we try to help instructors design learning experiences and assessments that create opportunities for students to develop perspective taking, because we hope that when they graduate, they leave with those skills and practice their skills every day in their lives after graduation. So super quick overview of some of our chapter highlights. We have a couple of different frameworks of intercultural competence. We have lots of fantastic concrete strategies for mentoring teachers from the literature and from our own experiences, both at the organizational level of how do schools do this as a whole, and how can individual teachers engage in this kind of development on their own. Lots of our examples focus on experiential approaches. So how do we do this through role play, simulation, going out into the community rather than just sort of more passive learning approaches. We've shared some case studies from Hong Kong, Hungary, France, and Austria to represent diverse continents and approaches to how universities and schools are doing this. We have several sample learning activities for course design and for perspective taking, including the Walk with Your Students activity that I've used in Japan and Hong Kong. And it's so fascinating that when you ask teachers to kind of walk alongside their students and envision the challenges in learning they're facing in a diverse classroom, what types of answers we get from teachers on all the different continents. And it's always a great experience. And then from Darla's work, we have a fantastic list of reflection questions for teachers that are very concrete, that both teacher trainers and teachers themselves can use to engage with critically reflecting on their own practice. So I just wanted to share with you one really cool example that we have as a case study in the chapter. This is a group of my students at the ESX School of Management in Paris, France, where I've had the opportunity to work with diverse groups of students from around the world. And this institution is very interesting. Intercultural competence is one of the pillars of their institutional mandate and their teaching, and they take it very seriously. I haven't seen such a commitment to intercultural development of teachers anywhere in the world, where teachers participate in at least 3 days of training on diversity and intercultural competence. They take a cultural intelligence questionnaire, both the students, the staff, and the faculty, and then they follow up at the end of their program and at the middle of their program. They use a diversity icebreaker workshops that were created in Norway to engage the staff and the faculty in being prepared to work with their students. They're a smaller school, about 5,000 students, so not a ginormous university with 30,000. And then I've had the opportunity to facilitate workshops on course design for intercultural learning for their faculty, and they've engaged with that so actively and creatively. So that organizational level of engagement where both the students, the staff, and the faculty are mentored for intercultural competence is really amazing to see and very inspiring. And I hope more of our institutions can kind of take that path. And so I don't want to spend too much time. One of the models we're using is a model that my colleague Aisha Haq and I developed on intercultural teaching competence, where we try to go beyond promoting intercultural awareness in teachers to really identifying concrete facilitation techniques and then curriculum design approaches that teachers can engage with along their learning journey. So if you're curious, please take a look at the original article or the table that's in the chapter that captures this. And it's not a prescriptive framework. We hope that it can be used as a tool for reflection with teachers, and we've used it in a number of different countries. Fascinating perspectives. The one that teachers find hardest are curriculum design competencies, especially designing inclusive assessments, and ones that allow multiple ways of representing knowledge. Not a surprise, I think, for anyone. And so in the chapter, we also have an example of the Walk with Your Students activity that guides students through an opportunity to think about taking a journey alongside their students, walking alongside their students, and reflecting on what the experience of a diverse student might be like as they're taking a course. What will they find challenging? What will they find easy? How can we support them in their learning journey? And so we create avatars, personas from very diverse backgrounds as we engage faculty with this activity. So one of the things we've done is to invite faculty to share their diverse students with us and to walk alongside them and create those personas in an activity that's been lots of fun on multiple continents. So I'll stop there. And if you have any questions, I'd be happy to answer. Thank you again for the opportunity to be here and for bringing this work together all in one place.
Thank you, Nanda. Okay, next up we have 3 out of 4 people who wrote a chapter together in our next section of our book, the section called Supporting Developing Global Competence in Pre-Service Teachers. Laura Stokowski, Kim Howard, Amara Stuhling, and Ken Pritchard wrote this chapter together. Ken Pritchard is not able to be with us this evening, but I did want to highlight that Kim Howard has the distinction of being one of 2 authors in this book who are authors or co-authors of more than one chapter. So Kim has put in an awful lot of work in this book. This team wrote The 5 C's of Cultural Immersion, academic : adding depth and meaning to international student teaching. So I'll let you all take it away. I'm not sure who's in the lead. Laura, I guess I'll turn it over to you. Thank you.
Thank you so much. I presume it's showing up correctly, yes?
Yeah.
Okay, great, thank you. So our chapter emerges from our work with the Global Gateway for Teachers in the School of Education at Indiana University. The Global Gateway for Teachers started 50 years ago last year in the early 1970s with placements on the Navajo Reservation. And the idea was that the professor who started it at the time wanted to increase the diverse opportunities that our teacher candidates had to engage in field experiences and student teaching with people who represented races, cultures, and nationalities and languages different from their own. Throughout the 50 years, cultural immersion has been the foundation of all of our programs. They're multifaceted. We include academic and cultural preparation before people go on site for full-time student teaching. They have to live in the communities where they're teaching. They engage in community-based service learning. And most important is the structure that my co-authors will be speaking about momentarily. We place student teachers on the Navajo Indian Reservation, in Chicago Public Schools, and in 21 countries worldwide. And so we really have Indiana University and partner university students all over the world, as you can see here. But what we will argue is that placement alone is not enough. You've got to structure in those preparatory and on-site requirements to maximize what they're learning when they go on site. With the idea being, help these future teachers learn to explore beneath the surface of that cultural iceberg so that they can begin to identify the values that operate in the communities where they're teaching and better meet the needs of those kids and families in their classroom. So at this point, I'm going to turn it over to Amara.
Great. Thank you, Laura, for the overview. Now, I would like to move into the main focus of our chapter, which is the 5 C's of cultural immersion, which are communication, cultures, connections, comparisons, and communities. We have applied the World Readiness Standards for Learning Languages as a framework for successful international student teaching placements. In language learning, these goal areas stress the application of learning a language beyond the instructional setting. And so now what we're going to do is take time to describe how each of the C's have direct applicability to the intercultural immersion experiences. Next slide, Laura. Okay, so first we have communication, where we aim for the student teachers to communicate with people from other cultural groups to understand similarities and differences in verbal and nonverbal communication, and to consider the relationship between language and cultural identity. Students prepare in our program by reading about intercultural communication and spending time with citizens of the host countries to begin building confidence in teaching and talking with others from different cultures. And then in the on-site reports, students thoughtfully respond to prompts about ways in which they are observing communication and the use of language, interactions between students and teachers, and the challenges and successes navigating the school and homestay relationships. Next one. And then we have cultures, which we define as interacting with cultural competence and understanding. And then that was expanded upon by asking students to interact with cultural sensitivity, competence, understanding, respect in their schools, homestays, and communities. The on-site assignments require deep exploration of the culture, including defining a cultural value or belief that the students are understanding through interactions and observations in their community. And that students also describe new cultural understandings from a visit to a historical or cultural site of significance. And they're also asked about what assumptions have been challenged through shifts in their thinking. And then one student in New Zealand, in her report, reflected on what she had learned observing a Maori kapa haka practice. And so we have this quote in the book. I learned about Maori beliefs in depth and how the slightest movement, such as a small hand flicker, is very meaningful in the performance. Learning about this aspect of student life taught me how important it is for minority students to have an opportunity through their school to practice their culture, because it shows that the school supports their personal background. Next.
All right, our next C is connections. And with connections, the goal is for student teachers to gain multiple perspectives, to be successful in professional and personal realms, and to connect with people and places in other parts of the world to bring a more authentic teaching and learning to one's own classroom. So to prepare for this, we encourage student teachers to get out of their comfort zones and ask them to consider the ways that they might form single stories or one-dimensional views of others and really challenge those. While they're in immersion experiences, we ask student teachers to write about and reflect on the ways that they're connecting with others. So for example, they write about things like their greatest personal and professional success of the week. They reflect on ways that they're connecting with others in their community through events that they attend, maybe a religious ceremony, or how they're helping with just tasks, maybe cooking or gardening in their community or with their host family. Forming connections with others is especially valuable for student teachers, And it's often those relationships that they highlight as one of the most meaningful aspects of their immersion experience. Next slide, please. Our next C is comparisons. So the goal of this C is for student teachers to gain a depth of insight through comparison of their home culture with that of their host site, and to interact with others from across cultures in ways that demonstrate sensitivity and respect. So to prepare for this C, we ask student teachers to first reflect on their own personal, social, and cultural identities. And then they also spend a lot of time researching their host countries, so they're prepared. While on site, student teachers compare aspects of teaching, like approaches to classroom management or how pupil achievement is defined. And then they also describing how they're modifying their own practices to align with their host school. So for example, one student teacher in New Zealand wrote, "The students are given the freedom to explore a topic of their choice, with the teacher acting as a guide and asking probing questions. I've had to shift my thinking since my home placement often focused on the teacher as the source of knowledge." Next slide, please. Finally, our last C is for communities. So with this C, the goal is to make the community a vital source of learning to better understand the families that are served by one school and to enable participation in the community marked by cultural competence. So one way we help prepare student teachers for this is asking them to complete a mini service learning project where they volunteer in an unfamiliar setting and interact with new people. An example of this might be volunteering for a conversation partner program. And then while they're on site, student teachers complete a much larger service learning project that serves the community on the premise of reciprocal exchange. So they're helping to provide a service, but they're also learning so much about the community through those that they're serving and serving alongside of. Oftentimes, student teachers will reflect on the ways their service learning project helped them better understand the community in ways they would have never experienced had they only solely focused on the school. For example, a student teacher in Italy volunteered with a community-based organization serving asylum seekers. And he said, "The program showed me the hidden and non-discussed immigrant culture that has become a part of the everyday challenges Italians face." So that project helped that student teacher develop empathy for the immigrants that he got to know personally through his involvement with that organization.
Thank you, Amara and Kim. And as we wrap up, I want to share this slide simply to illustrate the way in which we seek to help our student teachers gain different perspectives on the world and their role as educators in the world. So stepping outside of your comfort zone can be challenging and it can create that dissonance, but that's when real learning happens through experiences that require you to look at life from other people's perspectives. So finally, as we wrap up, you can't just place people in different settings and think that this kind of learning will happen. We really believe that you've got to structure it into the preparation for those experiences and then into the immersion experiences when they're on site. So thank you all very much. This was very rushed. I hope you'll read our chapter and we really appreciate the opportunity to share this with you. Thanks again.
You seem to be muted.
Carine. You don't know, you cannot unmute. Okay, now.
I've got it now. She's
Okay.
set me with an unmute button. Thank you. Thank you to you three. Well done. I apologize that our time is so short. We wanted to make sure we had as many people as possible, but that meant you had limited time. Lastly, we'll hear from Lainey Bender-Slack. Her chapter is in our Professional Development for Teacher Educators section of the book. This is one of the chapters with examples like the Walk with Your Students exercise that Nanda referenced of application of global learning in course design. So this is one of those hands-on chapters where you can take the ideas that she's going to share with you and apply them directly in your teaching. Her chapter is entitled, as you can see, Engaging Globally Oriented Literacies in Teacher Education, A Guide to Syllabus Revision. Lainey, the floor is yours.
Great, thanks so much. And yes, thanks for inviting me to be a part of this really important project. So yeah, mine was a little more, I'll say, very practical in that it came from that Global Teacher Educator Fellowship from 2017, 2018. And the idea was, as we were globalizing our courses, I wanted to, and I've been working on a faculty learning community with then talking to other colleagues about how to do this work. And so that's really where I think my work comes from. And of course, and I wanted to mention too, I'm a professor of literacy at Xavier. And so I'm always attuned to the ways of reading and writing and viewing and thinking and visually representing, listening, speaking, all of that. So mine is, I would say it's called globally oriented literacies because the focus is on language in those modes. And so definitely in teacher education, the rationale, of course, is that we've got a lot of teacher candidates who choose not to study abroad and teachers who perhaps haven't had lots of global experiences. So I really was focusing on the course, and I wanted just to share quickly, and the chapter goes into detail about everything, but I just wanted to skim the surface with some of the things that I talk about, because what I wanted to do is provide just a process or share my process to see if that would be helpful for others. And so the idea, of course, is that content area, so I use this content area literacy course. Now it's a course that everybody in Ohio in education has to take. So regardless of what they're teaching. So I get secondary math teacher candidates, and I have early childhood. So everybody's taking this content area literacy course. And this is just a brief, this is the course description that they see. So looking at methods and strategies, looking at comprehension, readability formulas. And I chose this one originally to globalize because I thought it would be the most difficult one. I knew, for example, I could globalize one of the literature courses that I teach in a way. I felt like that would be a bit easier. So this one I knew was going to be a little more challenging. So my goal was to just integrate internationalization across the course syllabus and then throughout the implementation of it. And so I broke it down just looking at my basic sections in my syllabus as competencies, looking at the calendar, looking at the assignments, thinking about my instructional decisions that I make. So my pedagogy, and then assessments. And so I ended up using the 4 global competencies from the Asia Society. And so that's one of the first things that I did, was to incorporate those into the lesson plan. So it might look something like this, where I already had course outcomes that were aligned with other, like NCTE, for example, or the Ohio Standards for the Teaching Profession. And so I wanted to really analyze this and figure out where the global competencies, what would be met more specifically in something in each of these outcomes. So I started because I wanted to just be thinking big picture, I guess, and then be thinking and then get into the details. And so what I decided to do was think about what new activities I wanted to incorporate. And so oftentimes, like my colleagues will say, well, that means I'm going to have to take something out. And I say, yeah, you might have to take something out as you're incorporating something new. And that's not necessarily a bad thing. This is just a different way to get to your learning outcomes. And so one of the examples I use right away is we do it on the first day, is the students all are their backgrounds in different disciplines. So I say, you know what, let's pick a country and just investigate how, for example, math is taught in a specific country. So they start to look through and find teacher resources there. But basically, by the end of this activity, one of the things that they realize is that not everybody's learning the exact same thing about math at the exact same time across the globe, right? So that if they get international students coming to their class, they can't make certain assumptions that some of that content was taught. So all of these activities, again, are described more deeply in the chapter. But one of the things that I do try to make sure that I do is an international activity. And so I'm trained in COIL, Collaborative Online International Learning. So with this course, I COIL every semester. So each time that I'm teaching this. And the idea with COIL is having that partner from another university and creating something so that your students get to, I think it's really important to get them to talk asynchronously first, and then they create some projects together. And this example was a photo essay. And so a few more things after then incorporating new activities. I was looking at incorporating new texts. So including global dispositions in some of the activities that we do in class, the how to be a global thinker, that article, and have students use that as they're creating some plans. And then even in something as simple as if I'm teaching some pre-reading strategies or monitoring reading strategies that I'm really intentional about, if I need to use a picture book, that it's a global picture book, or globally themed articles. So really trying to incorporate new texts, you know, in the teaching that I'm doing anyway. And then the assignments and assessments kind of go hand in hand, I think. But the idea was, so there are specific assignments that I am, you know, that everybody across these sections teach. So I have to continue to teach those. So then I wanted to analyze those specifically and say, okay, well, how do I make those more global? So just as an example, because they're creating a vocabulary activity to teach in the field, that they, because we study the SIOP model a bit. And so then how could they include some linguistic visual clues for English learners? So just something that they were already creating a vocabulary activity, but now let's think about linguistic diversity as I'm creating that. Or they do this, what I call a critical literacy text search. It's really a text set. And again, this was something that they were already doing, putting together, choosing some sort of concept, and then creating this text set, but then being really intentional about, can you find some global sources that you're going to put in there, you know, authors from other countries, that sort of thing. And then they do a textbook analysis. And so whereas they were already analyzing things like the readability levels and the cognitive demand, you know, I said, okay, well, let's see how global is this text as well, and how, you know, what's some evidence in the text there. So just incorporating that as a lens in all of the assignments that we do. And so this is what I share in the chapter, but the idea is, here's this course internationalization process, and locate your competencies, definitions, outcomes first thing. So figure out what it is that, you know, what's your basis there that you're trying to reach, and then plan your intercultural project, if that's COIL or something else. And then add those competencies through the syllabus and through that calendar in a way as you're incorporating the activities and the new texts and the assignment. So that's the gist of my chapter.
Thank you, Lainey. Thank you so much. I know you had to rush through it. Thank you to all the authors at School in the World who joined us just now. And let's see here. Let me remove your spotlight, and I'm going to bring up Bill Fernekes, and I'm very excited to welcome Dr. Fernekes here. He is a colleague of mine at Rutgers and a good friend of mine, and he's going to take it away to talk about the human rights imperative in teacher education. Welcome, Bill.
Well, thank you very much. I wanted to thank both Mary and Nilufer for inviting Gloria, Alter, and myself to submit a proposal for this wonderful series that they're doing. And I also want to say that it's going to be a hard act to follow after that last three presentations. They were fine, really very well done, and raised a lot of important issues. First thing I'm going to do is to introduce our two other members of the team who wrote the book that we're going to be talking about, and that's Paige Hershey and Kristi Rudelius-Palmer. I'm going to turn it over to them in a few minutes. And now I'm going to share the screen and give you some information about the book's organization and design. Okay, so we designed the book with three different sections, but I want to go through the contributors first because I think it's very important to recognize how we sort of chose the people to be part of this. Gloria and I are the co-editors. Gloria is a retired professor from Northern Illinois University, has worked a lot in human rights education, as have I. David Scheinman who is a real leader in the field, wrote the foreword. He's a professor emeritus, University of Vermont. And I would say the person who probably knows more about human rights education than anyone I know is Felissa Tibbets, who is formerly at Teachers College, Columbia, and is at Utrecht University in the Netherlands. She and Sandra Serrato at the University of Connecticut wrote the first chapter, which talks really about the urgency of the project of making human rights education a central part of teacher preparation. Then Nancy Flowers, who is, like David, one of the longtime heroes in human rights education, is a consultant who lives in Palo Alto. And one of our authors from the Global South, Abraham Magenzo K., who is a professor at the University of Chile. Their chapter talks about the history and the development of human rights education as a field of inquiry. We then turn to Audrey Osler, who is another great leader in human rights education, and her colleague Hugh Starkey. They're both from Great Britain, but Audrey also has an appointment at the University of Southern Norway. She's the editor of Human Rights Education Review, and their chapter is very interesting, talking about global citizenship and its relationship to human rights. Then our second author from the Global South is Ada Obiagu from University of Nigeria, who talks quite a bit about the issue of decolonizing teacher education. We then have Catherine Covell and R. Brian Howe, who have done extensive research on children's rights, empirical research, and their chapter deals with what it means to try to implement a child-friendly approach with human rights education. We then turn to chapter 6, and Gloria wrote a wonderful chapter on LGBTQ+ and how it's important to teach about the human rights of people who are LGBTQ+, but also providing very practical suggestions on how to implement that in elementary education. Paige and Kristi, as you see, are chapter 7. They'll talk about their chapter in a minute. I wrote the chapter on secondary education curriculum integration, and I'll talk about that later. Chapter 9, Glenn Matoma, who at that time of the writing the book, his chapter with Sandra Serrato was at the University of Connecticut. He's now at the University of California, Santa Cruz. What they did is they looked at the entire corpus of what came in the first 8 chapters and then developed conclusions and recommendations for teacher education. And I'll talk about them a little more later. And then chapter 10 was application strategies for how you could use the book in actual teacher education programs or in professional development. And Gloria wrote that, and I wrote a small section about that as well. I'll just briefly show you some slides here of the sections. The first section deals with the first 4 chapters. The rationale is chapter 1, the development, chapter 2, global citizenship, children's rights, chapter 3, and then global teacher education, decolonizing perspectives. The second section is the application section. And the first one deals with the whole concept of what Covell and Howe talk about, how it frames the practice of teaching and learning. Then we have Gloria's chapter, then followed by Paige and Kristi, and then myself. And the final section of the book is the conclusions and recommendations. Glenn and Sandra talk about the future. What is the future of global teacher education if it would have a human rights emphasis? Then the application strategy, and we have a very extensive set of 6 appendices and a comprehensive bibliography. So that's sort of an overview of the book. And before I turn it over to Paige and to Kristi, I'm going to stop sharing. And I just want to mention 2 things about why we actually felt this book was significant. First of all, you're probably aware that human rights education is not a mainstream component of teacher education in the US. We know that from empirical studies. We know it also from anecdotal work. But it's important, if we're going to actually establish it as a field of study in teacher ed, we have to know that it is a scholarly field of inquiry. And that's part of what we're doing here, establishing that to the field. It provides tools for conceptualizing human rights education in educational settings, along with application strategies. And it's also part of a broader effort, as we've seen in the first half of this webinar, to actually develop a more equitable, just, and compassionate society through education. And lastly, we chose people who could contribute to the book who were reflective of the diversity of the field, Global North, Global South, practitioners, theorists, people who have extensive experience, and people with somewhat less. So at this point, I'd like to turn it over to Paige and to Kristi, and they're going to talk about their chapter, and which deals with middle grades education, but aspects of human rights education that go beyond that.
Thank you, Bill, and thank you, Mary. And it was wonderful to hear from the authors of the first book, too. I think there's so many connections between what we're all doing. And so I really appreciated hearing from all of you. So when I started working on this chapter, I was working in teacher education and then have since moved back to the K-12 landscape. And so I am excited to share with you kind of, my experiences and connections between the chapter that we wrote and what I'm doing now, and being a school leader and supporting our teachers to be able to teach human rights education, and specifically about, to touch on the chapter that Kristi and I wrote, which is about teaching about migration through a human rights lens. So the most recent statistic I could find when we were working on the chapter was that at least 25% of our students, and this is in the US, are either migrants themselves or are children of migrants. And we know that in many, many areas, that percentage is much higher. And as we looked at, how to teach about migration, we really, one of the quotes that I came across was that, the success of our children who have migrated, children whose parents have migrated, their success is essential to our shared future. And so we all have a stake and an investment in making sure that our students feel included, that their stories of migration, the stories of their families, are taught in a sensitive and a culturally responsive way. We really leaned on culturally responsive teaching as we wrote our chapter, so that when we're explicitly teaching about migration through a human rights lens, we're using culturally responsive teaching throughout that time. And I also just want to call out, our own positionality. So the three of us presenting to you today about the book, and Kristi and I want to just, name that neither of us have individually migrated, but that we think that the real importance here is, to name that with our, whether it's with students or in our positions as teacher educators, but also to really then lean on first-person narratives. So how are we getting the voices of migrants and those who have migrated into our learning about migration? So I wanted to just share with you a little excerpt from a great book that we used as a resource in our chapter, but also that I've been picking up every now and then, called Solito Solita. And it's first-person narratives of crossing the border. And these narratives come from people of all ages, but mostly young people. And they're really about mostly Central American immigrants and migrants and their experiences at the border. So I'm just going to share a brief excerpt from a young man named Julio. I came to the border between Mexico and the United States in Nuevo Laredo at exactly 11 in the morning. The first thing I did was to check out the scene. I started to see people, hear conversations, find out about what time it was possible to cross and when it wasn't. I investigated all day long until I decided to cross at 9 in the evening. When I was about to cross, another person appeared. He was older, from Monterey. He found out where I was hiding. His name was Juan. He asked me, "What are you going to do?" I replied, "I'm about to cross." He asked, "Who are you with? Are you with a coyote?" I answered, "No, I don't have a coyote. I'm by myself." And we crossed. It was very dark and the river looked dangerous. The water was high and swirling. The river sounded so stormy, so strong. My heart was beating as if it was going to burst. And I just really love the, these stories in Solito Solita are really powerful. And I think making sure that, at whatever level we're teaching about migration, we're integrating first-person narratives. Gloria Alter, the co-editor of our book, also helped support our chapter by writing a case study unit on teaching about migration at the Mexican border. And we really wanted to make sure that connection was strong in terms of bringing first-person narratives into a case study, a unit of study for middle schoolers. We also then, I also wanted to highlight just the importance of bringing in the connections between those narratives and the human rights instruments. And in our chapter, we really highlighted the connection between the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, as well as the connection between children's rights and the stories of migration that we are highlighting in our chapter. In my position now as a director of a TK through 5 school, I'm not working directly with middle schoolers, but I just wanted to share a couple ways that I'm helping support our teaching team here to make sure that we are using some of the same practices when we teach about migration. So our 4th and 5th grade classes just did a unit in November and December on migration, an inquiry unit. And some of the things that they did and were able to, I was able to help support them. We first met with some concerned families who wanted to make sure that the way we were teaching migration matched what, that their family stories were being included. We had guest speakers who included people from the community, but also family members of our students who came in and talked with the classes about their own stories. We really made sure that, any of our children who have migrated themselves or have families who have migrated, it was really a voluntary, they didn't have to share their stories, but if they wanted to, they were welcomed and really made to feel safe to share those stories with their classes. And then when our students shared what they had learned about migration, they also were able to present that in different ways. And I have a few photos to share with you, so I'll just screen share a little bit so you can get some images that show what some of this learning looked like. So this is a parent of one of our 5th graders sharing his own story, but also teaching the students some Mayan. He speaks Mayan and also has been, working on making sure to maintain his culture and is teaching the students some Mayan here. This is all of our 4th and 5th grade students took a trip to Angel Island, which is here in San Francisco Bay, and through that process got to learn about the migrants who came through Angel Island. This is the expo where the students shared their learning. So this was one class that had part of what they did during their expo was they had some of our younger classes come through and answer questions in the citizenship test. And then this was our expo night for families, where one of our classrooms had different stations set up where it was an experience where families went through a migration process. And this is just a few of our students in their stations at the expo. So I'm going to stop there and turn it over to Kristi.
Thanks, Paige. I think one of our themes, and actually it's going to be one of what I will be talking about, our human rights classroom guidelines, which really is talking about how can we embody learning and teaching about, through, and for human rights. And those are core principles in the United Nations Declaration of Human Rights Education that was adopted by the United Nations in 2011. And those themes of the about, through, and for, we really laid out or attempted to lay out in human rights education classroom guidelines. So the first one, I think that Paige did a beautiful job of illustrating, is how do we really teach through personal narratives and even dive into, our own connected stories and who are we? So although I live very close to where I was born and raised, I recently had to write a story about the Wakpatanka, which is the Mississippi River in Dakota language. And how is that water connected to even my migration story of being a settler and settler in this land, and thinking through different ways of narrative and movement. A second component, so first, teach through personal narratives. Another part that is the brave space. How can we really set the stage in a human rights learning environment so that individuals are feeling like they want to share and they feel comfortable participating collectively. And that brave, oftentimes we talk about the safe spaces, but this notion around finding courage and finding your voice or maybe your creative voice in art was listed. So another core element is the use of inclusive and respectful language. We all know this, but then how can we listen to even the Mayan language that the students were hearing and see language differently, or even movement and closeness? How is that different? So that it's not solely a written word or a spoken word, but other ways of language, and to make sure that we're mindful of all of those different dynamics. Making informed instructional choices, which, selecting objectives and to kind of avoid potentially traumatizing activities. And that, it's very hard right now. There's a lot of trauma that we're facing, especially within the migration stories, or even thinking back on our own personal journeys or those of the students that were coming, and so how do you create space for what is going on in current contexts, so that you can kind of lean into those conversations, which we believe are really important. The fifth guideline, we talk about teaching migration across the curriculum. So really integrating, as Paige mentioned, the human rights and children's rights education approach. 6, to bring it home, linking the rights and experience of migrants and their issues into your local context. And lastly, kind of going beyond the lessons. So providing students with opportunities to take action. And we saw that illustrated going to Angel Island, and then also coming back to the classroom and showcasing the learning. So I think I will stop there, but also in our chapter, we talk about definitely the recommendations of going further. And I think I'll just mention that this year on December 10th, it's the 75th anniversary of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. So if you haven't gotten your passport, or and then we also at Human Rights Educators USA distribute the Children's Rights Treaty. So there's ways to also think creatively about how your young people can even create their own human rights and children's rights, or the rights of migrants documents.
Well, thank you, Kristi and Paige. I think you did a great job laying out the content of your chapter, and also pointing out, very importantly, that you can't have one or two of those 3 dimensions, about, through, and for. You really need the whole package in order to make this work effectively. Well, now we're going to turn to the section I mentioned before on secondary level or secondary grades curriculum integration. I wrote the chapter and focused on 3 different models. A district-wide model, which Kristi will talk about in a few minutes, called This Is My Home, which was based in Minnesota. A school-based model, which I drew upon the experience we had where I was a supervisor at Hunterdon Central Regional High School. And then individual classroom models, which we drew from the experiences of people in California who had been through the master's program at the University of San Francisco, which, I'm not mistaken, Paige is also a graduate of that program. It's one of the few doctoral programs, by the way, in the United States for human rights education. There are a number of obstacles that exist to integrate human rights education into the secondary school's curriculum. You're probably familiar with quite a few of them. One of them is that curriculum tend to be highly emphasizing discipline-based content, whereas human rights really goes beyond social studies or language arts. It can be across the entire curriculum. The second thing is that too much of secondary education is driven by high-stakes assessments in many states. And that becomes an impediment because it cuts down the time that classrooms can actually focus on issues-based education. And I would say a third thing, and very important, is that most people who enter public school teaching don't know very much about human rights. They don't know much about the content. So part of the job we felt in the book was to provide people with resources and models on how they could actually learn it while they're on the job. Because many people, and I'm one of them, I never had a course in human rights before I became a classroom teacher. So one of the issues we faced was, how do we actually implement a program like that? So I'm going to turn it over to Kristi now. She's going to talk briefly about This Is My Home, and then turn it back to me, and I can talk about the program we had at Hunterdon Central.
Thanks, Phil. The program that Bill is referring to that we outline in this book is called This Is My Home, a Minnesota Human Rights Education Experience. And we started, or this got its roots when I was approached by the Minnesota Department of Human Rights Commissioner for the state to actually do something preventative within schools, and could we do a curriculum? And I had said, well, no, there's already great resources out there. And they said, what hasn't been done? And I said, there hasn't been a K-12 scoped sequence modeling for integrating human rights education. And so they said, okay, we have to do that. And so what ended up happening is we pulled a lot of wonderful educators and started getting to work to try and figure out how could we do this. And we ended up coming up with a process model that really is kind of core. And I think, as Bill mentioned, the issue-based learning. So those 7 steps, another 7, I guess, started off with, having people observe and identify a core issue that they wanted to take on and a core problem in the community. Then being able to describe and compare, how that human rights issue is situated within a local, national, and global context. And trying to look at who else has done something around this beforehand, because you're building on shoulders, or other people have been grappling with similar issues. Then generating responses around what could potentially happen. The 4th is to really then select what you want to do in terms of taking on. As students really identifying what is that action, as even Paige talked about with the middle schoolers. And then observing and collecting information, the data gathering, and reflecting and drawing conclusions on what happened, and then communicating learning with others. And so a part of this process ended up being integrated into 4 different units. One, the K-12 model that we integrated this human rights learning into was a caring school climate. The grade 3-5 units were around human migration, which very much links up in our resources that also talk about migration and everyone's human migration story. The 6-8 was on justice and injustice, and the 9-12 unit was on US history. But a part of all of this was that we created even an online tool that folks could integrate and develop their own lesson plans out of. But it's really trying to figure out how can we realize that we're not just in school learning something, but again, and I think it was echoed in our previous speakers too, in their book, around how are you doing that community engagement? What is the reciprocity? How are you working with other communities? So I think I'll hand it off to you, Bill.
Thank you, Kristi. Well, at the secondary level, the district level that Kristi just talked about, and the school level, I think, are not necessarily the most ubiquitous. It's most likely that individual teachers are doing this. I'm going to talk about what we actually did in a school as a curriculum project. The state of New Jersey in 1989 decided that they were going to add a 3rd year of required social studies in world history and cultures. I was a supervisor at that time, 2 years into the job, and we convened a group of faculty to decide how we were going to implement this. We came upon the idea of creating what might be called a global studies class. We call it comparative world studies. And between 1990 and 2010, over 10,000 students. It was a very large high school. We had about 3,000 students for most of the time every year this was in place, took the class. And in that course, as juniors, they studied a 45-day unit in a block schedule of international human rights. We chose to make it issues-based, as Kristi has alluded to and as Paige has alluded to, because if you look at the way in which human rights education is structured and the literature on it, it's very important to not only learn the content, but then to actually apply it in the community. So the idea of an issues-based approach allowed us to be flexible, to change the issues year to year, but also to have a structure of the international framework of the United Nations human rights documents and address many compelling issues, whether it's migration, genocide, students' rights in the classroom, in schools, many different things, and including rights in conflict. So over those 20 years, those 10,000 students and the faculty who worked with them, I think, gained a great deal through this. The sort of sad moral at the end of the story, though, is that unless you have commitment in a district to carry things through when leadership changes, sometimes things don't persist. And unfortunately, a lot of the work we did at that time, I think, has now, 13 years later, somewhat eroded. So that's a lesson, an important lesson. I want to now turn, however, to one other reference, and that is the book by Susan Katz and Sparrow, and that's the individual cases that we drew into the chapter. And I think it's important because those individual cases, if you buy the book and read it, show how individual teachers integrated human rights education in their own classrooms. And I think that remains probably the most ubiquitous model of what's going on in the country today. I just want to close before we turn it over to the Q&A section to talk a little bit about the recommendations for change, because we did include in this book important recommendations for changing teacher education. And Glenn Matoma and Sandra Serrata in their chapter talk about these. One of them, very important, I think, is to integrate teacher education with community-based resources and have the teacher education programs, as we've seen in Indiana already, connect with the community and deal with human rights issues in the community itself. A second one is to form alliances between groups in the community that can contribute to teacher education, but aren't necessarily with children, for example, labor unions or religious organizations. There are many groups in communities that have important content and insights about human rights that teacher education necessarily hasn't in the past relied on or used. And I think an important one, a final one, is that it's important to keep in mind that as we go forward with trying to integrate human rights education into teacher education, we need to educate the people who educate the teachers. It's important that university and college faculty learn more about human rights in order to be effective in actually modeling what they can do in their teaching of their students. So let me turn it back to Mary, and I want to thank everybody for participating tonight.
Wow, thank you all. It's been really wonderful to sit here and hear about all of these chapters, and just makes me want to go and read more and learn more. Let's see here. I'm going to try and pull us all back up here so that everybody's here. We do have a few questions in the Q&A. And I just have all these ideas and things I'd like to share, but okay, let's see. So it says, traditionally, from Samira, traditionally human citizenship and rights were founded on the belief of equality, but recently there's been a shift to using the term equity instead. How does human rights education scholarship negotiate or distinguish between these two ideas, and what do they mean in human rights terms? Would somebody like to take that question?
Kristi or Paige, do you want to try and respond to that?
I'll jump in to just say it's a really big question. I think it's a really important question. And in the chat, we just shared some resources. And so Human Rights Educators USA is an organization. That's how Bill and Kristi and I all know each other. And it's one of the resources that was linked in the chat and also linked in that resource document. It's a Google Doc that we put together with resources from our chapter, but also things we talked about from today. And one of the things that we worked on through HRE USA was making connections between different disciplines. So, people working on social justice in education, people working on global citizenship in education. And so at HRE USA, we were really thinking about, well, how does human rights education connect with all these different approaches and disciplines that are really looking at achieving some of the same goals. So I think it's a big question to answer, here, equality versus equity, or how are they similar? How are they different? But I think that that resource that looks at, how is human rights education meeting with all these other different approaches that are actually trying to reach very similar goals would be a really good place to start to see how human rights and human rights education might answer that question. And Kristi, feel free to jump in.
I was trying quickly to find an image, but I'll try and describe it. JEDI, I mean, I'm not sure how many of you are using, I mean, there's the DEI, the, diversity, equity, and inclusion, and then justice now is, is JEDI, the justice, equity, diversity, and inclusion. And I think that the image that comes to mind is many of you may have seen, the three different people standing or looking over a fence and not being able to see it. And then all of a sudden with equity, there's different balances across. And then with justice, all of a sudden that solid fence is eroded so you can see through. And so I think that it's all of these components are very integrated into the learning process. And I think they're really rich with conversation for your students to even begin to try and think through those differences as well. And those, the interconnections of all.
Mary, if I could just add one thing, I would say that it's very important for people in the classroom and in university level to raise those issues as questions, not as closed issues. They're open for debate. And it seems in this country right now, there are certain forces that are trying to limit debate. I think it's a terrible thing, and we need to remain open to the idea that points of view other than our own are valid and important as long as they're shared respectfully. But defining terms, challenging different definitions, and debating them is critical.
Thanks, Bill. So there is another question here from Astri. Do you also include political or systemic analysis in your chapter, as in how the US hegemony and imperialism worldwide influence, if not heavily impact the exigence of forced immigration and the narratives around it, in connection with some of the current state level interventions and issues of race in the country, since the history of immigration, migration, slavery included, is heavily compounded with colonialism, racism, xenophobia, and capitalism. How would you approach, or what would you recommend teachers and teacher educators interested in integrating your topics in the classroom praxis? How do they put this into practice? It's a big question.
I'll just start and then I'll hand it off. I think as a basic premise, we have to be open to the idea that there are multiple interpretations of not only terminology, but historical narratives. And that seems to be questioned these days by certain political forces. So I don't have any problem with what the question is. My concern is that a person would approach it and say, well, this is what racism is, this is what xenophobia is, and therefore that discussion's over. So I think what we have to think about is, how do we approach these as issues that are open for debate, open for interpretation? And I think that opens people in a classroom climate that people feel comfortable, they can actually talk about it without reprisal.
Thank you.
And
Go ahead.
I would, I ended up facilitating a decolonial workshop, an anti-racist workshop, and I was forced to try and think through my positionality. And I think when we've talked about, I guess, the personal narratives, one really good tool that I've found to be useful is the I am from poems. And I've written about it a little bit, but even one, I think it's really important educators write their I am from poems, and they will change. But where are you from? And having your students do the same, because I think you don't know, as much as we say, try and know the migration story of your students, or even, at higher ed, all of the teachers, people don't know. And it's then you're able to say, what does it mean to you? And even on the unlearning, decoloniality, whatever it is, how do you honor who you are and recognize a lot of those dissonance and challenges of, okay, what about settler colonizing? We are here, we have not left. Yes, I was born, but and being able to say, yes, it's a part of me that I'm struggling. I continue to struggle with that component through kind of the I am poems. We found those to be really rich, and then the conversations can begin with who are we? And then I think you can bring in these issue-based, issues and coming from, I'm on Dakota land, I mentioned here in Minneapolis. So we really worked through, and are working through the George Floyd murder. And the one addition I would add is I had written something around storytelling for racial justice and for, challenging systemic racism. So I think that those are just a couple tools that I think storytelling is powerful. I think really diving into our personal narratives are important.
Okay, I think you can see my screen right now with addresses. If you need to get in touch with people. We've come to the end of our time, and I just want to thank all of our presenters for sharing their global education and human rights education efforts with us today, and for their book chapters that you can all dig into for more information. So we hope you found it inspiring to hear from colleagues who are developing and building intercultural understanding, creating transnational partnerships, engaging in transformative practices, as we all work together to prepare youth with a critical intercultural mindset and the knowledge and skills for active civic and community engagement that will lead to protecting human rights and liberties in our local and global context. So please feel free to reach out to any of us for more information. I apologize the chat was not live today so that we couldn't have a lively conversation, but you can certainly follow up with any of us. I know we have visitors here today with us from Kenya, people registering from Mexico, Nigeria, China, people who are here locally from Uzbekistan. And so thank you so much for joining us. You can find copies of the book if you go to the Rowman Littlefield website. And if you have any ideas for a new book in the Global Teacher Education series, please reach out to Nilufer, Guler, or me. And we look forward to future sessions, conversations, and collaborations with all of you and our friends around the world. So thank you for joining us today.